discuss all that today with Arnab Das, Global Macro Strategist, EMEA of Invesco. He's expert on that issue. Well, a very good evening to you, Mr. Das. First of all, let's begin by talking and understanding what does new threats mean for India, especially. Do you think they're renewed threat, or he's just repeating what he said earlier?
Look, I think, for India, this is going to be symbolically quite important. I don't think it's going to make that much difference because India has a services trade surplus with the US. And it's not, the bulk of the trade has been moving to services, not goods. I think the general context in which we have to see this is that, in a certain sense, President Trump is correct. The US, before the first Trump administration, and of course, before this one, the current Trump administration had lower trade barriers overall, both tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, than almost every other large economy by quite some distance, including India. So I think this is part of the strategy to try and correct that, if you want to call it that. And it's part of the strategy to try and impose some leverage on those countries to open their markets more strongly to US exports. I think in the case of India, it is true that India has some of the highest tariffs in the world. They're not specifically directed against the US. They're directed against all kinds of countries. And I think it would be a very good thing for India to lower those tariffs and make India's economy more open and more competitive. Now, will it have that effect? I think there's some of that already going on. There's been waves of trade liberalization in India since the crisis in 1991, as I'm sure you and many of the audience are well aware. And that has been accompanied actually by an increase in the growth rate of the Indian economy, an increase to some extent in manufacturing output, although not very big increase as a share of GDP. And I think, if India wants to become a serious manufacturing powerhouse, as it says it does, and would clearly benefit from doing, it would need to have a much more open economy, a much more competitive economy, and a much more productive economy that has a more level playing field between all kinds of corporations, foreign and domestic, manufacturing and services. I think the big question for India, as well as other countries, is that what President Trump is trying to accomplish? Will it have that effect? Or will this just be, taking the US back to a more protectionist history and a more protectionist preference that President Trump himself has? I think the reality will be somewhere in between. There'll be some of all of the above. It won't be entirely one-sided. And having said that, I would also say that I think that the very high tariffs that President Trump is threatening against some of the US's largest manufacturing trading partners, particularly Mexico and Canada, will be extremely disruptive to those economies, but also to the US. So I think in the end, there's going to be some sort of accommodation where the tariffs on Mexico and Canada in particular go up to some degree, right, but not 25%. And I hope not. Because I think that will be extremely disruptive, like I say, for the US. Sorry,
yes.
Go ahead, please.
Mr. Das, I would like to ask you a question on this. Do you think that the tariff war is now entering a new phase? Because China today said that they are ready for all kind of wars, maybe tariff war, trade war, any war. On the other hand, Mexico is also going to bring their own tariffs. So do you think it is going to enter a new phase now?
Yes, I think there is retaliation that is taking place. I'm not sure I'd call it an entirely new phase because there were retaliatory tariffs in the first Trump administration. And I think we've been in that mode for some time. I think this is taking it to a new level because the tariffs are higher, they're more abrupt, they're more, sort of more comprehensive in many respects, across the board. And of course, they're aimed against Mexico and Canada in particular, which are part of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement that President Trump himself and his people had negotiated with those two countries in his first administration. So I think what we're looking at is a much more unilateralist America first, MAGA, make America great type of stance, very aggressive, very unilateralist, very much aimed at allies as well as adversaries, if you want to put it that way. And so in many respects, a new era and a new kind of style, if you want, of aggressive international economic policy But the tariff part of it, I think, is not, and the retaliation of the tariffs themselves are not the very new part. The new part, I think, is, like I said, the aggressiveness, the comprehensiveness, the abruptness, and the fact that it calls into question trade agreements that have only just recently been renegotiated. Now, so a significant amount of disruption.
Yes,
Will
Mr.
it
Das,
be
I
the
would
end
like
of
to
the world
understand
as we
from
know?
you what. Yes. Mr. Das, I would like to understand from you what options does India have now? Our Commerce Minister is already in US trying to maybe pacify the US powers that be. So, in your opinion, what can be India's options now?
Well, I think it's worth, trying to negotiate with the Trump administration. I don't think they, really have it in for India in any particular way. I think they see India as an important partner, economic partner, services trade partner, and of course, potentially a geopolitical partner as well. So I think India does have some leverage, but like I was sort of suggesting before, I still think the best thing for India to do is to sort of say, the Trump administration and others that have complained, other US administrations, other governments that have in the past pointed out that India has very highly distortionary tariffs, tariffs that really distort, that really change economic activity from the way it would take place, and not necessarily to the benefit of India as a whole, maybe to the benefit of some companies that are protected, that it would be best for India actually to take this as an opportunity to pull the rug out from under the Trump administration and lower India's tariffs. Of course, politically, that might be difficult to do, particularly when you're being threatened with these very high tariffs for India or any other country. But I think that is actually the right response. And I think for many countries that are actually, in my opinion, in a weaker position than India, the retaliation is really not going to lead them very far
Right.
because most of those countries have big trade surpluses with the US. And the US is the one with big deficits. So the US is in a better position, albeit at some cost to itself, to
Right.
keep raising the tariffs. And those countries will eventually run out of room for retaliation. The final point I would make is that I think
Right.
this is substantially directed in the end at China, because it's clear that China and the US have a bilateral rivalry and competition that is intense and that is shared on both sides. And I think both countries want to be less dependent on each other. That is not generally true of most of the other countries that are being targeted with tariffs by the Trump administration. So that's why I think there's room for negotiation and room for trade liberalization.
Right.
I don't think there's going to
Yeah,
be anything like a
we got the
comprehensive
point.
multilateral trade deal, but bilaterally, there might be some accommodations that are achieved between India and the US, between the European Union and the US,
We,
between Canada and Mexico and
well,
the US.
well,
And of course, I think
that's
it
quite
has to be recognized
very
very
correct,
clearly
Mr.
that this is
Das.
no longer, sorry, yes, go ahead.
Right. Right. So that's all we wanted to check from you, Mr. Das. Thank you very much for joining us this evening and giving a perspective on this the trade war that is taking a new turn now. And